A significant escalation just a few days, less than a week until this October 7th attack. And I do want to put up just some of this images from earlier on here out of Israel as we were watching it unfold live, raw, and unfiltered. As you see, some of these rockets light up the night sky over Israel, the Iron Dome doing their job. Also, the U.S. Navy helping to defend Israel there in the Middle East, but certainly a growing escalation. Let's bring into the conversation right now VP of the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us as we're watching this unfold, a significant escalation. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, saying that there will be consequences. What could those look like, and what do we make of what happened earlier today?
Well, I think, first of all, this was inevitable, unfortunately. I mean, I think, we have to understand here that the Iranians were the people who trained Hamas. They were the people that essentially funded and organized the October 7th attacks. They are the primary patrons of Hezbollah, and that's a group that's been firing rockets, 8,000 of them, at Israel over the last 11 and a half, almost 12 months. We saw a direct altercation between Israel and Iran back in April. Iran back then fired some 400 missiles, drones, and rockets into Israel. The majority were intercepted. And nothing has forced the Iranians to back down. Every time Israel has tried to defend itself, what we've actually seen is an administration that has called for greater restraint. The Israelis have tried to abide by that, and I think maybe it was a few weeks ago, they realized that they just simply couldn't do it anymore. And then we began to see some of these remarkable operations take place where the Israelis utilized that pager, that beeper operation that ended up killing and injuring a number of Hezbollah operatives. After that, we saw a number of targeted killings of senior Hezbollah leaders. That was, of course, followed by the strike on Friday that took out Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah. The Israelis have been on a counteroffensive unlike anything I've seen. After 11 plus months of showing that restraint, they unleashed. And now the Iranians are saying that it was their turn to respond. Of course, what the Israelis were doing were hitting Iran's proxies, not Iran itself. But nevertheless, that's their justification. So they fired off these 181 ballistic missiles today, the majority of which did not hit their intended targets. A few apparently did get through, but not a lot of damage was done in Israel, thankfully. So now I think we have a couple of things that we should expect. One, the Israelis are going to respond. And the last time around, after the 400 different missiles and drones, the Israelis responded by hitting one radar installation. This was a radar installation in the area where some of Iran's most sophisticated and sensitive nuclear sites are located. And the Israelis took that out, and it was kind of a sign to the Iranians, like, hey, we can do this, and we can get around your missile defense, so don't test us again. The Israelis didn't take credit for it. It was all done very quietly. And this was at the behest of the Biden administration. I think from what I'm hearing right now out of Israel, that will not happen again. The Israelis will strike back. I think there will be wide array of targets. I think the Israelis will take responsibility. But I think the interesting thing right now is some of the messaging coming out of Washington that might, and I need to underscore might, indicate an American response. And there, I think we could see the decision, for example, for the U.S. and Israel to jointly strike nuclear facilities that have been concerning both countries and a lot of Western countries in Europe and elsewhere. We've all been worried about that Iranian nuclear program. Maybe this is the moment, finally, where the West and Israel take matters into their own hands, because I do think that, unfortunately, diplomacy has run its course. The Iranian regime really does look unhinged with this proxy war they've been fighting. They've set the Middle East on fire for a year now. Someone needs to bring this to an end.
Yeah, almost inevitable that that would happen. I want to get into that in a little bit, but you also posted this on social media saying the Israelis bound to strike the Middle East tonight. Quite a declaration. And like you mentioned, they just attacked that one radar installation last time around, and it did take almost a week until that happens. What do we expect, and what could a response, maybe the U.S. involved, you said it would be a big might, but what would a response from Israel look like, and what could it look like tonight?
Yeah, I mean, look, first, I think you need to understand the Israelis, as of, I guess, about maybe an hour and a half ago, their war cabinet was meeting. It's been described by some in Israel as maybe the most consequential war cabinet meeting that's taken place in decades there as they think about how they want to respond to the Iranians. But I think in terms of targets, I mean, first of all, we need to acknowledge that what the Israelis have been doing over the last, let's say, 5 or 6 days, they have destroyed something like 70% of Hezbollah's top leaders. They've taken out a lot of their significant capabilities, their most dangerous weapons. They are, I mean, they are really doing a body of work that I didn't even think that they were capable of. Incredible intelligence, incredible precision, and the pace has been dizzying. And I think we can probably expect more of that, right? Targeting Hezbollah, but also don't forget the Israelis targeted the Houthis in Yemen. They've been targeting Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria, all the while they continue to hit Hamas in Gaza. They're attacking Iran's proxies on 6 fronts, and it looks like they're about to open up a seventh, targeting inside Iran itself. I would guess that they will be looking at nuclear targets. I don't know what kinds of capabilities they have to get deep underground, but I think that needs to be at least part of the menu that they're looking at. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, these are the sort of top forces that are the most loyal to the regime. I'm sure there are targets right now that the Israelis are looking at. They would probably love to take out some of their top leaders, maybe some of their missile silos, their underground facilities that are housing some of those long distance ballistic missiles that hit Israel tonight. From there, I think it's an interesting question. I don't know where the Israelis are on this, but for the longest time, they insisted that they would never target the legitimate leader of another country. But I think that as we're watching the Iranians continue to vow that they seek the destruction of the state of Israel and nothing less than that, and they've started to match words with deeds. I think there's probably some within that Israeli war cabinet that are wondering whether it's time to try to decapitate some of those senior leaders.
Very, very interesting there. Very interesting comments about what it could look like. And you mentioned the nuclear program that Iran continues to build. And I think the world is watching that very, very closely. When you say that they could potentially go after some of these, would the U.S. have to be involved if they decide to kind of try to limit them in their capabilities for a nuclear weapon? Or would Israel be able to do it on its own in that regard?
It's a good question. And I think a lot of it has to do with I guess the leanings of the president, the commander in chief, and maybe with some of the advice that he would get from Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense over there at the Pentagon. It might be that the U.S. says, look, we're not going to carry out offensive strikes against Iran, but rather provide defensive cover to the Israelis. So that might mean taking out specific assets on the ground. That might be the kind of thing that they do. In other words, neutralize some of Iran's capabilities if they were trying to attack Israel, giving the Israelis that wide cover to be able to do what they need to do.
All right, that is very, very interesting. And of course, we're looking kind of into the future to predict or foresee what could come. Let's go back in time, though, because this was double. That's what the Pentagon's saying, the amount of rockets, ballistic missiles fired toward Israel. You mentioned a few did get through. In terms of the attack in April and the attack that we saw this morning, are there any other similarities that you can point out?
Well, the numbers were about half, but it was apparently all ballistic missiles, no drones, as I think you mentioned at the top of our chat here. And I think that's interesting. They apparently what they did is they learned from the ballistic missile strikes that they launched last time. They figured out what got through and what didn't. I think they've been trying to perfect their craft, if you will. And that's an interesting development in and of itself. What did get through, I think the Israelis are not going to be honest, at least for a time, about what got through and where. They don't want to give the Iranians the ability to learn again. And so what we hear right now in the Israeli press is don't report, don't show what got through, because that will help the Iranians perhaps in future rounds of strikes, which I fully expect will come if the Israelis do what we expect them to do tonight or tomorrow or over perhaps the next week, when they fire back at Iran and they claim credit and they escalate further. And I do think that is an inevitable I mean, it's an inevitability right now that the Israelis are going to fight back. When that happens, the Iranians will likely want to fire more of those ballistic missiles, and the Israelis don't want to give them any hints or clues as to what works and what doesn't.
I remember some of the questions during the State Department briefing were about that because, like you mentioned, they potentially, Iran did learn from the first attack in April to what happened today. Do you think today was another learning experience for them? Do you think it was not necessarily to intend to harm Israel, but to learn for a future attack? Is that a possibility?
Oh, you got to remember, every time we see any kind of hostilities like this with foes that have not had regular battles with one another, they are learning in real time. So Iran is learning and they're seeing what gets through. They're looking at how Israel's missile defense is activated. The Israelis are learning. They're looking at the trajectories and they're looking at the launch sites. They're looking at whether these missiles are solid fuel or liquid fuel. I mean, they're learning a lot about what's being shared right now. And then there's the U.S., which has eyes on all of this. And I think, obviously we've got a technologically advanced military. It's, that they are learning in real time as well. And I think obviously, they took part in shooting down some of these missiles, as did some of the other allies in the region. We're hearing Saudi Arabia, Jordan. I didn't hear anything about the Brits out of Larnaca tonight in Cyprus, but that may have also been part of it as well as what happened in April. But I'm sure that the Pentagon right now is studying these launches. They're trying to figure out where maybe some of those weaknesses are again, because if we see a coordinated U.S.-Israeli response, and that is still not a certainty, but if it is coordinated, I'm sure that learning what happened just now, a few hours ago, will bring something to the table when it comes to U.S. response.
Yeah, we'll see how they are involved, and like you mentioned, maybe the menu of what the response could look like. And you mentioned some of the other players involved in that region. Lucas Tomlinson, Fox News, talking about the U.S. Navy guided missile destroyers in the eastern Mediterranean engaged some of the incoming ballistic missiles headed for Israel. That's according to officials. And a lot is different from April to now, and that also includes the U.S. forces in the region. How did that play a factor today, if at all?
It was not a factor. And that was actually surprising because I believe that right now there's a greater force posture on the part of the United States than there was back in April. I think it's something like almost double what was back then.
Correct.
And so that should have been the thing that would have deterred the Iranians. It should have been the thing that maybe forced them to pause. And, I think that may have something to do with the posture of the United States right now, saying that, at least indicating the possibility of direct U.S. involvement, because the U.S. is trying to enforce its own authority right now in the region. They warned the Iranians not to do this. The Iranians did it anyway. I think the message here will be that actions have consequences. It's not necessarily about defending Israel, but rather, I think, really about enforcing the U.S. led order in the Middle East. Because right now, the Saudis are watching, the Emiratis are watching, the Kuwaitis, the Jordanians, all of our allies in the region are wondering, what good is it if the United States says don't, and our words ring hollow with our enemies and adversaries? If we don't begin to show that we've got a little bit more skin in the game, we may lose some of those alliances. And that's not something that I think the United States is willing to countenance.
Yeah, and they keep reiterating it during the Pentagon briefing, talking about de-escalation. That's what they're urging in the region. But if the U.S. potentially does get involved, then that is a very big if in the response. What changes? What does this dynamic do to the conflict, the tensions in that region?
Look, I think the Iranians, on some level, are probably just begging for that moment, because what it means is that the U.S. has gone in, at least optically, on behalf of Israel, and that any losses that Israel might sustain can be tracked back to the Israelis. It may inject further tension in the U.S.-Israel relationship. I think the Arab world, however, would probably be very welcoming of this. I think they want to see America finally bring down their arch enemy, the Iranians. You have to remember, it's not just that they've been terrorizing the Israelis over these 30 plus years, but they've been terrorizing the Arab world, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, et cetera. The entire region has suffered as a result of this revolutionary regime. And so I think the dynamic across the rest of the Middle East would be one of relief. I think the Israelis, I'm sure, probably would feel relief too, but maybe understand that there are consequences of the United States getting involved. I should note parenthetically that the Israelis continue to say that they want to do this by themselves. They don't want a drop of American blood spilled. This has been their insistence from the get-go since 10/7, if not for decades before that. And so I think you're not going to see the Israelis ask. If the United States says, we volunteer, we want to do this, I think the Israelis will obviously not say no. But they, again, I think they're very aware of the optics here. It's a delicate moment.
Yeah, all these hypotheticals on the precipice of a larger regional conflict. And I do want to ask you, because off the top I mentioned it, we're less than a week until October the 7th, the initial attack there by Hamas on Israel, a very difficult day in that region. In the timing of this, is there anything to it in your mind? And as we approach that day, October the 7th, a year later, the one-year anniversary, does anything feel different in that region?
Look, I would say that if you asked me, just at watching the events over the weekend, it was a stunning reversal of momentum in this region. The Israelis, it looked like they were on their back foot after 10/7. Obviously, an intelligence collapse militarily. They really didn't look like they had their act together. It took a long time to get through the various brigades that Hamas had in Gaza. Some of that was actually stymied. That progress was stymied by the United States and political considerations, forcing the Israelis to slow their progress. But what we watched over the weekend was just Israel cutting through these proxies like a buzzsaw. I've never seen anything like it. The rapid fashion, the intense pace of these strikes. It was remarkable to watch. And so now I think Iran is trying to stymie that momentum by firing back at the Israelis and trying to hit targets inside Israel. And apparently they were not successful, but they were trying to reverse some of that reversal of momentum, if you will. And so I would say that was the significance here. I think the Iranians kicking off a war right before the Jewish New Year in Israel, I think may have I think there may have been an attempt to kind of deflate the Israeli population because that's usually a holiday. It's a time of family and celebration. But what I'm watching right now also out of Israel is nothing short of total defiance from the population. The people right now are bruising for a fight. They're ready. After a year, what I hear across the board is, let's do this already. We're ready to drop the gloves. That's an interesting development too. So I think when Iran maybe takes stock of what happened today, I think they're probably going to say to themselves, okay, we didn't reverse that momentum. We didn't get through to the Israelis. We didn't bomb what we had hoped to bomb. Maybe if a couple got through, that's a victory, but not a big one, sort of a Pyrrhic victory at that. And now look at what we've done. We have poked the hornet's nest, and now the Israelis are having that meeting in the pit, as they call it, and underground in Israel's Ministry of Defense, making plans for how they're going to make life miserable for the Iranian regime. So quite a lot of drama right now in the Middle East, and I think it's probably just getting started.
Yeah, we're just on the beginning of it. The complexion of this conflict getting very more interesting and changing by the day, especially after the attack early this morning. All right, Jonathan Schanzer, thank you again. I appreciate your time, your insight, as always, here on Live Now from Fox.